It's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. David Egan earned his doctorate in philosophy at the University of Oxford and has taught at a number of institutions in Canada and the United States and the UK. He's joining us from Canada this morning for him, but this evening for us, for some of us. He also, very interestingly, teaches philosophy classes online for the general public. Really interesting site at eganphilosophy.com, so please check that out. He's the author of The Pursuit of an Authentic Philosophy, Wittgenstein, Heidegger, and the Everyday, a 2019 book. And he's currently working on a book on animals, or our animal nature. We've been having, just before the session, some interesting chats about that topic. And his question tonight is, was Wittgenstein an existentialist? So, David, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Great, thank you. And thank you all so much for being here. I have slides, so I'm gonna see before anything else if I can get this set up right. So give me a moment. So hopefully in just a moment you'll see the thing I want you to see. You should have a slide that says with Wittgenstein and Existentialist on it, and if you don't, shout. So yeah, first of all, thank you very much for having me. Second of all, happy 133rd birthday to Wittgenstein. It's a particular pleasure to be talking about Wittgenstein on Wittgenstein's birthday. I should also say that there's a sort of a particular, there's a nice feeling for me to be here, is that the first conference I ever traveled to attend, as distinct from, a conference that just happened to be happening at the university I was at, was the inaugural British Wittgenstein Society conference in 2008 on a third Wittgenstein at the University of Hertfordshire. So that was the first conference I ever attended. And I was surrounded by all these real philosophers doing real things, and I felt all intimidated and daunted by the whole thing. And so it's a real honor to feel like I've been welcomed to be one of you, at least to some extent. So the title of the talk was Wittgenstein an Existentialist. Some of you may be familiar with Betteridge's law of headlines, which says that any headline that has a question, the content has to answer with a no. And indeed, spoiler alert, that is the answer I'm going to give in this talk. The question then is why this should be news. Who on earth actually claims that Wittgenstein is an existentialist, such that I might need to say that he isn't? So in effect, the main burden of the talk is to lend some plausibility to the idea of Wittgenstein as existentialist, and to suggest that there's sort of an attractive way of reading Wittgenstein along those lines that I think doesn't quite capture what's going on with Wittgenstein, but hopefully in spelling that out and spelling out why I think it's problematic might also help articulate certain connections that Wittgenstein has with certain aspects of existential phenomenology. So I will say a little bit about where I'm going before I go there. I want to begin by saying a little bit about Iris Murdoch, who's kind of my frame setter, in the sense that Murdoch, I think, draws some interesting connections between existentialism and British philosophy in the 20th century, mid-20th century, and in particular on Jean-Paul Sartre. And so I'm going to say a bit about Sartre's conception of freedom, and then lay out the case for Wittgenstein as an existentialist in a Sartrean mold, before making the case against this way of reading Wittgenstein. And then I want to conclude by situating Wittgenstein in relation to both Murdoch and Sartre. And the way in which I'm going to make the case against Wittgenstein as existentialist is going to draw on aspects of training and play and improvisation in his work. And so I want to sort of situate then this conception of improvisation that I draw out between a conception of existential choice that we find in Sartre and a conception of vision that is central to Murdoch's thinking. So that's roughly where I'm going to go. So just to begin with, I mean, to introduce or to use Murdoch as my motivation for this talk, the obvious obstacle to seeing Wittgenstein as an existentialist, as I noted at the beginning, is maybe a simple one of tradition. That, Wittgenstein worked in an Anglophone context. His primary influences were Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell. And although he was contemporaneous with figures associated with existentialism like Sartre and like Heidegger, there's very little evidence of any kind of actual influence between them. Although here I should note that the previous talk by Maria Balaska drew out a lot from a very interesting moment in Wittgenstein where he does, one of the rare instances where he does actually comment on Heidegger. But likewise, the development of existential phenomenology seems pretty much untouched by Wittgenstein's influence. So Murdoch, I think, is an interesting point of connection here, in that on one hand, she was the author of the first English language study on Sartre. Sartre, Romantic Rationalist, was published in 1953. But she later cooled on Sartre, and ultimately cooled on him while also starting to see intriguing connections between him and various mid-20th century Anglophone philosophers. So on the British side, she compares Sartre to figures like Ayer, R.M. Hare, Stuart Hampshire, Gilbert Ryle. And despite considerable differences between the French existentialists and these British philosophers, and considerable mutual disdain between them, on her view, they were all swimming in roughly the same water. And she sees the shadow of Wittgenstein looming over a lot of this. So these sorts of ideas get spelled out primarily in the essays collected in The Sovereignty of Good, although she also starts talking about it in an earlier paper, Vision and Choice in Morality. So she spells out what she calls an existentialist behaviorist type of moral psychology that she finds common between Sartre and a lot of mid-20th century British moral philosophy, which conceives of morality in terms of making choices between options that are publicly accessible and accessible, and that these choices manifest a free exercise of the sovereign will, and that this exercise of the will is the ultimate source of value. So she articulates this conception of moral psychology in a comparison to a shopping trip. She says, on this view, one might say that morality is assimilated to a visit to a shop. I enter the shop in a condition of totally responsible freedom. I objectively estimate the features of the goods, and I choose. And Murdoch's concern here is that this way of thinking about morality and choice hollows out the inner life, that any notion of sort of inner struggle or inner deliberation gets emptied out, that there's simply this sort of, what she calls it, a separate point, a burrowing pinpoint of consciousness. She describes the moral agent on this view as pictured as an isolated principle of will, or burrowing pinpoint of consciousness inside or beside a lump of being, which has been handed over to other disciplines, such as psychology and sociology. So on one hand, you've got this idea of a public world that is a matter of objective fact, and then you've got a sort of an isolated pinprick will. There's no sort of actual inner content. There's just this deliberating and acting choice. And so we also get this sharp fact-value dichotomy on this moral psychology that she's critical of. And as I said, she sees Wittgenstein looming behind all of this. She remarks that Wittgenstein remains sphinx-like in the background, that Wittgenstein has created a void into which neo-Kantianism, existentialism, utilitarianism have made haste to enter. And she's a bit cagey about Wittgenstein's responsibility for this. You can see here that she says he remains sphinx-like in the background, that she is wary of attributing to Wittgenstein himself this existentialist behaviorist moral psychology, but she does think that he has some influence on it. And I'll come back in just a moment to sort of spell out how it might make sense to see Wittgenstein sharing this view. But I just want to say very quickly something about the alternative that Murdoch presents. So Murdoch is critical of this view, and in particular, critical of the idea that choice and will are kind of the center of what is morally significant. And her the sort of the moral vision that she draws out instead emphasizes vision and attention instead of action and choice. So this idea of vision and attention is one that she draws significantly from Simone Weil. It's had in turn considerable influence on figures like Cora Diamond and Martha Nussbaum. But the basic idea is that rather than thinking of ethics as a kind of decision procedure, where I'm sort of faced with a bunch of options and I make a choice, that she argues that the really significant work comes in paying close, and as Murdoch emphasizes, loving attention to the particularities of a situation, that when we learn to see clearly and attentively, that is where the kind of the genuine moral work takes place. And in doing so, she also wants to reject any kind of sharp fact-value dichotomy, that what it means to perceive something attentively and lovingly is a perception that is shot through with value, that there is not just a matter of assessing facts, but apprehending a situation in its moral complexity. So I'll say a bit about how I see Wittgenstein fitting into this picture that Murdoch wants to criticize, before ultimately arguing that I think Wittgenstein is closer to this conception that Murdoch herself advocates, although I'm also going to try to create some separation between Murdoch and Wittgenstein. But first, I want to say a bit about Sartre himself, and to articulate a bit more about this conception of freedom, which is central to Sartre's thinking and which is central to what Murdoch is critical of. So in spelling out, I think there's something really interesting about the similarity that Murdoch identifies between Sartre on the one hand and mid-20th century British moral philosophy on the other, that it's sort of an unexpected connection. And I think there's something provocative and fruitful there. In doing it, though, I think she does pass over a significant difference, which is that when Sartre calls himself an existentialist, he's calling himself an existentialist within the context of existential phenomenology and existential phenomenology. So while Sartre and I think Beauvoir are the only people to sort of properly embrace the title existentialism, the label of existential phenomenology does apply to a number of other figures who rejected the existentialist label, including Heidegger, as well as Merleau-Ponty and a number of others. But one of the things that is significant here is, and one of the things that motivates Heidegger, Sartre, and others, is the idea that the philosophical tradition hasn't furnished us with adequate terms for conceiving of human existence. That in particular, they want to argue that neither an idea of human beings as substances with a fixed essence, nor as subjects situated in a world of objects, adequately captures the distinctive predicament of human existence. And this kind of rethinking of what it is to be human is something that, I just don't think you find in any pronounced way in the mid-20th century British philosophers that Murdoch compares Sartre to. So I think it's important to say a bit about how Sartre's conception of freedom is situated within a particular way of thinking about human existence. One way of spelling this out is to say that, the conception of human beings as, substances with fixed essences is sort of, maybe one that is motivated by a certain kind of scientific worldview, according to which, we are, one biological organism among others, and, we can be studied by the sciences of biology and psychology, and that will give us our appropriate situation within the broader natural framework. And it's not so much that people like Sartre want to deny the validity of scientific approaches, but rather to deny that they are the appropriate starting point for reflection on human existence. And in particular, somebody like Sartre, and this is true of Heidegger as well, want to place a lot of emphasis on our status as beings that ask questions, as inquiring beings, so that scientific investigation then emerges as one expression of a fundamental capacity for questioning. And we need to get clear on what that capacity for questioning is in itself before we can even make sense of ourselves as the sorts of beings that, among other things, engage in scientific inquiry. So inquiry is central for Sartre, and this is related to a number of other ideas that get developed early on in Being and Nothingness, which is his sort of main early work. I won't be able to go into all of this in any great detail, but I'll just sort of quickly jump through a couple of these hoops. So, with the capacity for inquiry, for Sartre comes this capacity for negation, that we're able to inquire not just about what is, but what is not, that when asking a question, we are sort of conscious of an absence, and this sort of capacity to be open to nothingness and to negation. Sartre thinks is a distinctive feature of human beings, and distinctive insofar as we are characterized by consciousness, that consciousness has that capacity for apprehending nothingness as well as being. And through our status as conscious beings, that's how human freedom comes into play. So Sartre, rather, you can see who I think about more. Sartre says that human freedom precedes essence in man and makes it possible. That he wants to say that our freedom isn't, if you were to kind of characterize human beings, you wouldn't be able to just say, well, here are a bunch of facts about human beings. One of the many attributes of human beings is that they have this freedom. Is rather that he wants to say that freedom in some sense is prior, that we can't adequately characterize human existence until we've got a grasp on this conception of freedom that he wants to draw out in being and nothingness. Here's maybe one way of spelling it out, is in terms of the problematic of free will and determinism. And those of you who have either taught or been in a class that sort of deals with the problematic of free will determinism, you might sort of talk through students through the various different options, lay out, what would need to be the case for a, free will thesis to hold, or for a hard deterministic thesis to hold. And you could imagine, a student coming to be perfectly persuaded that the hard determinist thesis is true, that, as it happens, everything that I say and do and think is simply a matter of causal processes of, brain neuron firings or whatever else. And that, what I do is just as causally determined as, rocks falling when, gravity is acting upon them. And so the student is totally convinced of this, walks out of the classroom, and then decides that they're going to have lunch and reflect on what they should have for lunch. And it may be the case that, the reflection on what they should have for lunch is itself, causally determined in some way. But you cannot reflect on what to have for lunch by saying, gosh, I wonder what the neurons are going to do now. That whatever may be the metaphysical facts of the matter, you are in the condition of having to make a choice, that you cannot escape from that condition of making choices. And taking on a thesis of hard determinism doesn't free you from the condition that you fundamentally exist in, which is that you must make choices. And this is, in effect, the freedom that Sartre wants to emphasize, is the idea that, independent of whatever else you might want to say about science or anything else, the condition of human existence is one of existing in a state of freedom where we make choices and we are responsible for those choices. And this gets summarized famously in his slogan, existence comes before essence. The idea being that, what we are isn't something that is given in advance, but rather it's through the choices we make and through the deliberations we engage in that we give expression to the kind of being that we are. So one way that I think Sartre spells this out in a way that I think is helpful is through his discussion of vertigo. So he says that this experience of freedom, when we experience it, honestly and robustly, gives rise to an experience of anguish. This is angoisse in the French, and you're very deliberately connected to ideas of anxiety, of angst or angst, that you find in Heidegger and Kierkegaard as well. And he spells out what this experience of anguish in the face of freedom is in this famous example of vertigo. So you can imagine somebody kind of standing at the edge of a cliff and looking over the edge. And on one hand, you might experience a kind of fear there, that there's a threat that, a sudden gust of wind or a bit of loose rock, and I might go over the edge. That kind of fear is a fear of something, of potential causes acting on me from without. Anguish, by contrast, is, as Sartre conceives it, a distrust of my own freedom, that in addition to the possibility of loose stones or gusts of wind or whatever else, there's also the possibility that I might throw myself over the edge. And what's terrifying about vertigo, according to Sartre, what's anguishing, the source of anguish there is that although I very much do not want to go over the cliff. There's nothing in my present condition that can constrain my future freedom. That any resolve I make right now has no compelling constraint on what I do a second from now, for example. And it's that sort of recognition that at every moment I am free to leap, and nothing that I resolve on now could prevent me from doing that, that Heidegger thinks is the characteristic of anguish as distinct from fear. So he says that vertigo is anguish to the extent that I'm afraid not of falling over the precipice, but of throwing myself over. A situation provokes fear if there's a possibility of my life being changed from without. My being provokes anguish to the extent that I distrust myself and my own reactions in that situation. So Sartre's account of freedom then makes us seem more radically free than we might ordinarily suppose. That just in terms of kind of everyday phenomenology, I'm familiar with a certain degree of freedom, that when this talk is over, there's a number of different things I might do. I haven't yet decided what, but I have that freedom of choice. But I don't normally think of myself at every moment as possibly, jumping over cliffs or anything else like that. And in particular, when I reflect on my own sort of freedom in an everyday sense, I might say that one of the striking characteristics of that freedom is how constrained it is, that I might want to just go on a holiday to Hawaii, but I can't just chuck everything and get on a plane. I have to pay the rent and all these other things that I can't do these things I want to do. There's a beautiful sunset, but I can't linger. I need to get home to my family. That there's all these ways in which we often experience our own freedom as something that is constrained or limited. And one of the things that Sartre wants to do in his work on freedom is to emphasize that we are much more free than we ordinarily suppose. That if I feel like I cannot, chuck everything and get on a flight to Hawaii, that is a choice. That I have freely chosen that, my need to pay rent and go about my ordinary business is somehow more of a priority to me than getting on that flight to Hawaii. And for Sartre, I am acting in bad faith if I pretend as if my not getting on that flight is a consequence of my being somehow unable to, that it's somehow something acting on me from without, when, as Sartre wants to emphasize, it is in fact a consequence of my own free choice that I don't get on that plane. So this sort of more radical conception of freedom, where all the things I think I cannot do are, according to Sartre, in fact, things I've chosen not to do. You find echoes of this much earlier. So, Epictetus, I think, is one really striking forerunner of this conception of radical freedom. So Epictetus, in a number of his discourses, admonishes students who say they can't do such and such because, if they did it, they would get executed. He says, well, you can still get executed. You're still freely choosing that your life is more important than holding by your principles if you choose to do something dishonorable rather than choose to be executed. So, with people like Sartre on the one hand, and like Epictetus maybe in an earlier incarnation, there's this emphasis that our freedom extends far more deeply than we might ordinarily suppose. And I want to argue that there is a certain way of understanding Wittgenstein on rules and logic and mathematics that contains a similar argument that we are much more free than we ordinarily suppose. And I want to spell that out now before trying to distance myself a bit from it. So I want to begin with one of the more famous passages in the Philosophical Investigations. This is the parable of the wayward pupil that you find in section 185 of the Investigations. So we begin with Wittgenstein saying, let's suppose we've done some exercises and tested his understanding up to 1,000. So he's imagining getting a pupil where we teach this pupil various mathematical sequences, showing them how to add numbers in different ways. And we've run this student through various drills up to the number 1,000. And then he says, then we get the pupil to continue one series, say +2, beyond 1,000. And he writes 1,000, 1,004, 1,008, 1,012. So here's the puzzle that the student, we teach him the rule add 2, he goes 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. We're like, wonderful, this is great, 996, 998, 1,000, we think wonderful. And then the student says 1,004, 1,008, 1,012. So suddenly the student seems to be adding 4. So Wittgenstein follows up this thought, says, we say to him, look what you're doing. He doesn't understand. We say, you should have added 2. Look how you began the series. He answers, yes, isn't that right? I thought this was how I had to do it. Wittgenstein then goes on to say that in such a case, we might perhaps say that this person finds it natural, once given our explanations, to understand our order as we would understand the order, add 2 up to 1,000, 4 up to 2,000, 6 up to 3,000, and so on. So, all the while that we were training in this series add 2, the pupil just assumed that it was natural that when he gets to 1,000, he should then go on 1,004, 1,008, 1,012. A lot has been written about this. One way of understanding the issue, and this is one that Kripke develops in detail in his book on Wittgenstein and rules and private language, is to point out that any given mathematical formula can conceivably be interpreted in indefinitely many other ways. So, that symbol +2, effectively, given all of the training and all of the instruction the pupil has had, is consistent with what Wittgenstein, toward the end of this paragraph, describes as the rule add 2 up to 1,000, 4 up to 2,000, 6 up to 3,000, and so on. And so it seems as if all of the training that we've been given, there are at least 2 different ways of going on beyond 1,000. And in fact, at least 2 ways of going on at any point, and more than 2 ways of going on at any point. And so the thought then is that if I were to continue beyond 1,000 to say 1,002, 1,004, 1,006, I'm not simply following the rule, but then if there are indefinitely many other ways I could have gone on, I must be interpreting the rule when I go on in that way. And what's more, my interpretation of the rule is itself a rule. It's a rule for how to follow the rule +2. And so if that interpretation is also a rule, that rule itself stands in need of interpretation, and then we stand in front of a regress of interpretations of interpretations of interpretations. And there's this worry that there's nothing that can possibly ground our rule following practices. So Wittgenstein has his interlocutor kind of raise this worry in section 198. He says, but how can a rule teach me what I have to do at this point? After all, whatever I do can on some interpretation be made compatible with the rule. Now, there's probably been more written about how to make sense of Wittgenstein on rules than there has on pretty much anything else in Wittgenstein, and I don't promise to give you anything strikingly novel here, but I want to suggest that there is a sort of an existential Wittgensteinian reading of these passages. And I'm going to draw on Michael Dummett's early influential paper on Wittgenstein's philosophy of mathematics to spell out how that might work. So this is Dummett writing a paper on the then recently published remarks on the foundations of mathematics. So slightly off from the rule following case I just presented, but very much, I think, in the same ballpark. The remarks on the foundations of mathematics deal a lot with what it means to follow a rule. And in particular, Dummett is trying to interpret how Wittgenstein conceives of mathematical proof. And he says that each step, that is in each step of carrying out a mathematical proof, or for following a mathematical proof, we are free to choose or to accept or reject the proof. There's nothing in our formulation of the axioms and the rules of inference, nothing in our minds when we accepted these before the proof was given, which of itself shows whether we shall accept the proof or not. And hence there is nothing which forces us to accept the proof. If we accept the proof, we are making a new decision and not merely making explicit a decision we had made already. So the idea there is that at every stage of following a mathematical proof, for reasons that connect to the stuff on rules that I just alluded to, we are free to make a decision. We are not simply following out a proof that kind of compels our agreement, but are free at every moment to accept or reject, to follow along, as it were. And there's some support for this interpretation. I mean, for instance, in section 186, Wittgenstein remarks that it would be almost more correct to say not that an intuition is needed at every point, this is in the case of sort of following out a mathematical sequence, but that a new decision was needed at every point. So I want to propose that what you're getting here is, in the mathematical domain, a version of this kind of Sartrean existentialism. That, as I said earlier, we typically operate under what, to Sartre's view, is an illusion of our choices being far more constrained than we think, and that actually we're much more free than we suppose, and that it is, for Sartre, in bad faith to claim that our choices are more constrained than they are. And on Dummett's reading of Wittgenstein, there's maybe something similar going on in the mathematical domain, that it might seem to us in a kind of bad faith way that we have no choice but to follow out the proof at each stage. But it would be a mathematical bad faith to think that our following out the proof in this way is compelled at every stage. That Wittgenstein, according to Dummett, wants us to recognize that at every moment we're radically free and responsible for our mathematical choices, as it were. And I think that, on one hand, there's a significant difference between saying that, Wittgenstein is some kind of mathematical existentialist and seeing some kind of more broad existentialism that you find in Sartre. But I want to suggest that there's maybe grounds for thinking that Wittgenstein's philosophy of mathematics, as Dummett conceives it, is the sort of the thin edge of a wedge or the thin end of a wedge that sort of then drives you toward a sort of a broader existential viewpoint. And I think you can get to this by comparing what's going on in the existential case with skepticism. So here's one way that you might motivate an argument for external world skepticism. That you start with some kind of paradigm case of knowing, like here is a hand. This is the famous example that Moore uses in his proof of an external world. And the thought of choosing a paradigm case like that is that if I know anything, I know this. That if I know anything at all, I know that here is a hand. And of course, the contrapositive to that statement is that if I don't know this, I don't know anything. And so if you can cast doubt in the paradigm case, that doubt can then be corrosive. That if I can doubt that, then all of my purported claims to knowledge get cast into doubt, get cast into question. And so I want to suggest that there's maybe something similar going on with Wittgenstein in the practical case with regard to mathematics. That, if there's any instance in which knowing how to go on is compelled by the circumstance of the situation, surely that would be in the case of logic and mathematics. That if there's any case in which I know how to go on, it's in following out a proof or following a sequence of numbers or that sort of thing. And that then means that doubt in this paradigm case is corrosive. That if I can introduce doubt about even how I go on in logic and mathematics, then all the more so I should cast into doubt any constraints that I perceive in my choices in simpler domains like what I should have for lunch or whatever else. So in that sense, you could maybe read Wittgenstein not just as dealing with logic and mathematics, but using logic and mathematics to cast a kind of a broader doubt on any perceived constraints in our freedom. And this is the way in which I can imagine us seeing Wittgenstein's work on rules and on mathematics as opening up a possible kind of existentialist Wittgenstein in the Sartrean mold. And I think that, I used skeptical arguments as a way of introducing this idea. And I think the resemblance here to skeptical arguments isn't just incidental, that I do think that there's something like what I, in the previous slide, called practical skepticism at work in the way that Sartre thinks about freedom, that there's this worry, and I think this worry is present in the way that Sartre deals with anguish, that in the face of radical freedom, it's unclear that I have any basis whatsoever for acting. So, the positive existentialist vision is one where I exist in this situation of total freedom, where I, at every moment, am unconstrained in making identity-defining choices, that my choices are what, in some sense, determine my essence. But there's a worry that is hard if these choices are radically unconstrained. How we might conceive of them as choices at all, and how we, in particular, might distinguish them from random impulses. That if there is nothing that can constrain or motivate me to make one choice rather than the other, then it's unclear I have any basis for saying why I made the choices that I made. And then unclear whether I can even make sense of it as a choice at all. That, presumably a choice is something that I make for particular reasons. But if I'm completely unconstrained in my reasons, then it's not clear that we're dealing with anything resembling a choice at all. So this idea is one that I think it's a worry that I think we encounter in a lot of work in this domain. So Dennis McManus has written, I think, really well on Heideggerian anxiety, and he describes it there as the motivation problem in Heidegger. That, in the context of existential anxiety, how am I so much as able to find the motivation to kind of carry on in a way that defines me, rather than just kind of acting at random if I've kind of lost all basis for choice. McManus thinks that Heidegger has a way out of this worry. I am inclined to agree with McManus on this. I'm less confident about Sartre. And I'll come back, I'll briefly touch on Heidegger toward the end. But I think that this is a real worry that we can apply to Sartre or to anybody that we cast in a Sartrean mold, including our existentialist Wittgenstein. So now I want to start pivoting toward, so what I mean to say here is, on one hand, there's this exegetical question of, is this picture of Wittgenstein as existentialist a compelling one? But in addition to that exegetical question, if we do find ourselves persuaded that Wittgenstein is some kind of existentialist, this should make us worried that if that's so, then Wittgenstein has something to answer for here, that there is this, I think, a deep worry at the heart of a lot of existentialist thinking that would need to be addressed. I'm going to start now moving Wittgenstein away from this approach. But I want to hold on to this idea that there's a kind of a skeptical, a kind of practical skeptical problematic at work here. And in drawing a kind of a non-existentialist Wittgenstein out, I'm going to sort of take a kind of guidance from the way that Cavell reads Wittgenstein as engaging with skepticism in The Claim of Reason. So according to Cavell, Wittgenstein's teaching is everywhere controlled by a response to skepticism, or as I will prefer to say, by a response to the threat of skepticism. And I think there's something really deep and really right about that I do think that there is something going on in Wittgenstein in a deep way that sees skepticism as a threat. And in particular, Cavell wants to kind of expand our conception of what we call skepticism. He says that I do not confine the term to philosophers who wind up denying that we can never know. I apply it to any view which takes the existence of the world to be a problem of knowledge. I should just pause there before I say more about what I find useful there to note that at least in the first two sections or the first two parts of The Claim of Reason, Cavell really focuses on this problem of external world skepticism. And here he's, I think, significantly under the influence of Thomson Clark. And while I think there's a lot that is really interesting there, I also just think exegetically it isn't right on Wittgenstein, in the sense that I just don't think that external world skepticism is the thing that significantly animates Wittgenstein for the most part, except for maybe a bit in Uncertainty, but certainly not in the philosophical investigations. I do think that Cavell is right, that there is a concern about skepticism that pervades Wittgenstein's later philosophy. I just don't think it's external world skepticism. And indeed, in part 4 of The Claim of Reason, Cavell turns more to other mind skepticism. I think there's something really right there. But in particular, I think that this idea of existentialism as a kind of practical skepticism is of interest to me. This, so it's not so much how do I know that there's a world external to my senses, but rather on what basis do I have in any instance for acting in the way that I do? And I think that that is a concern that is prominent in the rule following sections, and is one that I think is prominent in a lot of Wittgenstein's late philosophy. So what I think is telling about this passage in Cavell, this idea that he doesn't want to confine the term skepticism to those who deny that we know, but rather anybody who takes that as a fundamental problem, is I think that, that there's maybe a temptation, if you want to say that Wittgenstein isn't a skeptic, to say that he's presenting anti-skeptical arguments. And I think one of the things that's really interesting and revealing about the way that Cavell proceeds is to say that, look, if you have accepted the skeptical problematic as one that you have to grapple with at face value, you have already, in some sense, accepted the skeptical problematic. So, for example, Kripke presents what he calls a kind of a Humean skepticism in Wittgenstein, and then offers, his reading of Wittgenstein is that Wittgenstein offers a skeptical solution in a Humean mold to this skeptical problem. And as Cavell would conceive it, then what Kripke is doing is remaining within the skeptical problematic. He's sort of accepting the terms that the skeptic provides. And that as Cavell reads Wittgenstein, he wants to see him rather not as sort of refuting the skeptic, but rather affirming the thesis, or rather taking it as undeniable and thereby shifting its weight. That in a sense, rather than saying, you know, accepting skepticism on its own terms and then refuting it, he wants to somehow accept it, but accept it in a way that it ceases to trouble us in the way that it had before. And that sort of approach is one that, although I'm not dealing with external world skepticism, I think we can find as a helpful way of reading Wittgenstein as a non-existentialist, as it were. That I want to see him as sort of, in some sense, accepting this practical skepticism, but in a way that shifts its weight. And in particular, in doing that, I want to offer an interpretation of Wittgenstein on training and learning as centrally involving play and improvisation. And I think that that's sort of one way of getting clear on how this existentialist Wittgenstein is not the Wittgenstein that wrote the philosophical investigations. So I want to start by following out a clue that Wittgenstein drops in section 198. So this is the one where he, you know, earlier in section 198, he raised this worry about, you know, if every interpretation of a rule is itself a rule, then I face this regress of interpretations. His interlocutor then asks, so is whatever I do compatible with a rule? And Wittgenstein replies, let me ask this. What has the expression of a rule, say a signpost, got to do with my actions? What sort of connection obtains here? Well, this one, for example, I have been trained to react in a particular way to this sign, and now I do so react to it. Now, this idea of training, this is abrichten in the German, is, I think, sort of sneakily all over the place in Wittgenstein's later philosophy. I don't want to say that it gets no attention in the later in the commentary, but I think is a very important idea and one that, you know, could warrant more scrutiny. And in particular, when Wittgenstein talks about training, he's usually talking about it in contrast with things like explanation, the giving of reasons, and so on. So, for example, in section 5, he says here, and he's talking about some of his early language games, here the teaching of language is not explaining, but training. And the idea of training as distinct from, say, explaining or giving reasons is that it's a non-rational, or rather a pre-rational process, that any kind of explanation I might give you would take place within a language game. That when we've established a certain language game, one of the moves I might make within that language game is to provide an explanation for some activity that we're doing. But before I can give you explanations, you need to have adopted the language game. And that initial induction into a language game is one of training, that it's not one that I explain or reason you into, but rather it's something that I simply train you into. Before you can engage in activities like explanations, giving reasons, asking for reasons, and all of the rest, you need to be trained into the practice of doing so. And that then is necessarily logically prior to any kind of explanation or giving of reasons. So in effect, you know, this gives us some insight into what's maybe going on with the wayward pupil in section 185, that the problem, in effect, is not that the pupil has not sort of accepted our reasons, but rather that somehow the training itself has misfired. That, you know, it's not that there is a reason why you should go on 1002, 1004, 1006 rather than 1004, 1008, 1012, but rather we need to have established that basic training before we're even able to kind of engage in any kind of mathematical reasoning. In section 206, so this is a worry that Wittgenstein stays with, is this question of like, how does this training take hold? So in section 206, he says that following a rule is analogous to obeying an order. One is trained to do so when one reacts to an order in a particular way. But, and here's the worry, what if one person reacts to the order and training thus and another otherwise? In effect, this is what we got with a wayward pupil in section 185, that, you know, this pupil reacts to the training differently than we wanted them to react to. Who is right then? And Wittgenstein then, you know, in the sections that follow, follows up on this question. But I think the basic thrust of what follows section 206 is that he wants to say that that question, who is right then, is the wrong question to be asking. And one way of putting it is to say that, you know, first of all, we're kind of prior to questions of right or wrong. You know, questions of right or wrong are questions sort of within, again, a practice rather than prior to that practice. But I think in a deeper way, and here is, I think, the way in which Wittgenstein wants us to see the case of the wayward pupil in other cases in a way that isn't simply this kind of skeptical problem of how can we in any case know what we're supposed to do next, is that he wants us to see that there has to be a certain amount in place before we can even talk about right and wrong, correctness, rules, following orders, and so on and so forth. That we're only able to make sense of those concepts because there happens to be a training that everybody, for the most part, goes along with. That if it were, in fact, the case that whenever we try to train people, each person responded differently to the training, we simply wouldn't have the kind of regularities that we then describe as rules and orders and so on. I think you get a nice example of this in section 142. So Wittgenstein says it is only in normal cases that the use of a word, this is a slightly different context, so I'm not going to explain all of what's going on here. It's only in normal cases that the use of a word is clearly laid out in advance for us. We know, are in doubt what we have to say in this or that case. The more abnormal the case, the more doubtful it becomes what we are to say. And if things were quite different from what they actually are, if there were, for instance, no characteristic expression of pain, of fear, of joy, if rule became exception, exception rule, or if both phenomena became phenomena of roughly equal frequency, our normal language games would thereby lose their point. So part of, I think, what he's saying there is that, it's not that there are these things, namely pain, fear, joy, and then we just sort of happen to have these words that we're able to slap onto them as labels, but rather, I'm able to talk about pain and fear and joy because there is, as it happens, certain common regularities in the behavior of human beings that we're able to notice and pick up on. And those regularities then enable us to have a language game. So it's not that there is this thing called joy that is independent of all of the language games we play, that, if only we were able to coordinate our language games accurately, we would be able to slap a label on that thing, but rather the concept of joy only becomes available to us because there is a certain regularity in response. And he illustrates this point with this nice example of a lump of cheese. So he says the procedure of putting a lump of cheese in a balance and fixing the price by the turn of the scale would lose its point if it frequently happened that such lumps suddenly grew and shrank with no obvious cause. So I think the wrong way of reading this lump of cheese example would be to say, I couldn't weigh cheese if it kept on changing its size and shape. Whereas in fact, what Wittgenstein is saying is something simpler. He's saying we wouldn't weigh cheese. That the concept, we only have a concept of weight because things, for the most part, don't change their shape and size. And if they were always changing their shape and size, there would just be no use for a concept of weight, and so we wouldn't have it. So this, in effect, I think, is the limited truth of the skeptic's position, that there is indeed no good reason why we take up training in the way that we do. The misstep that then feeds the skeptical problematic is to suppose that because there's no good reason why we take up the training in the way that we do, and that there is no good reason why all of us happen, for the most part, to be quite regular in the way that we take up training. The mistake would be then to suppose that reasons are lacking here, that that there's a gap that ought to be filled and alas is not. That again, the point is that the whole idea of being able to ask for and give reasons, to have good reasons, are all things that are only possible in a context where we have been trained into certain language games and into certain practices with a certain amount of regularity. So this is sort of the way in which I see Wittgenstein is not quite following the existentialist mode, is that I don't think he's saying, oh my gosh, there's no good reason for anything we do. Rather, he's saying that the reasons that we're able to give are a consequence of our having been trained in a very particular way. Now, there's a worry here that we have kind of replaced the random choice that we face in radical freedom with some kind of automation that comes about through training. That, if I'm simply trained to respond in certain ways, there's a worry that maybe what we've got now is the opposite of freedom and equally problematic, that now children are simply frog marched into certain practices that such that there is no freedom at all. And so in a way, I feel like, to get an accurate reading of Wittgenstein, we need to sort of steer between the Scylla and Charybdis of sort of radical unconstrained freedom on the one hand, and a kind of automated frog-marched training that removes freedom from the picture altogether. And I think we do get this in Wittgenstein. And in particular, I think that we get this in Wittgenstein if we are sensitive to the role that play has in the way that Wittgenstein talks about training. So I'm going to take another passage somewhat out of context that I'm not going to spell out the full context for. This is section 83 of the Investigations, where Wittgenstein says that we can easily imagine people amusing themselves in a field by playing with a ball like this, starting various existing games, but playing several without finishing them, and in between throwing the ball aimlessly into the air, chasing one another with the ball, throwing it at one another for a joke, and so on. And now someone says the whole time they're playing a ball game and therefore are following definite rules at every throw. And is there not also the case where we play and make up rules as we go along, and even where we alter them as we go along? So one of the burdens here is that Wittgenstein is trying to give coherence to the idea that behavior and language use can exhibit regularities without anybody explicitly formulating rules, that I don't need to be kind of consciously following a rule in behaving in a certain regular way. But what you see in this example, which I think is familiar in all sorts of aspects of life, is our capacity to coordinate our behavior with one another without any explicit agreement. And I think this is maybe the appropriate way to think about what Wittgenstein is talking about when he talks about training. That effectively what you have when Wittgenstein talks about training is two people coordinating their behavior with one another in a circumstance where, reason giving an explanation only have so much hold. That, in the context of training, there's a sort of a coordination that can't be, as it were, logically compelled, but rather just has to be sort of worked toward. And in any actual instance of training, it is in fact the case that, the trainer isn't simply, forcing the other person to do a particular thing, but usually needs to find the right kinds of inducements, the right kind of guidance, the right kind of leads to line the person's behavior up. But I also want to suggest that this kind of training, where there's a particular practice that I already do, and I want you to do the practice as well, is maybe a limiting case of this broader spectrum of play. That, all play involves some kind of coordination of behavior between people. The limiting case of training is where, there's the one person who's simply kind of trying to get the other person to align their behavior with them. But, in most instances of play, there is sort of some kind of coordination where both people are sort of adjusting their behavior, responding to one another. You might say that play is a kind of mutual training, as my friend Gabriel suggested to me, that there's a sort of training going on in play. It's not one-sided, that both people are sort of adjusting their behavior responsively to one another. And since I've already, shown my Cavelian stripes, I should note that, I think that there's something similar going on here in part 2 of the Claim of Reason, where Cavell talks about learning and projecting words. That, when he talks about the idea of projecting words into new contexts, it's important to Cavell, and I think he is drawing on a feature of Wittgenstein that's very much there in Wittgenstein himself. That you're projecting words into new contexts, there's always a certain amount of freedom and play. That there aren't sort of strict rules that kind of railroad you in the direction of future language use. And so I want to also suggest that this idea of play and responsiveness extends well beyond just the context of training. It's not something that simply exists in the context of bringing somebody outside of a practice into a practice. So, for example, in section 208, Wittgenstein is talking about, imagining teaching somebody French. And he says, look, if you already speak English, then I could maybe teach you French by just giving you the French equivalents of different English words. But he says, if a person has not yet got the concepts, I'll teach him to use the words by means of examples and by exercises. And when I do this, I do not communicate less to him than I know myself. And that idea, this idea that when I provide this teaching, I'm not communicating less than I know myself, is an idea that you find at a number of different points in Wittgenstein's later thought. The idea that we're mistaken if we suppose that, somehow in my head, I already have, the entire practice worked out with all of the rules and all of the rest. But then, the problem is somehow how to get, all of that stuff into the head of the other. Wittgenstein wants to point out that even in my own case, there is simply the practice that I go along with. And, there's a certain amount of looseness even in my own adoption of the practice. So it's not simply in training somebody into a practice, but also in engaging in a practice. There's a certain amount of freedom and a certain amount of play within the practice. So in the book that I wrote, this is the Pursuit of an Authentic Philosophy, I try to spell out Wittgenstein's thinking about play by likening it to improvisation. So musical improvisation, theatrical improvisation. Um, but what I find in improvisation is this sort of happy middle ground between these two worries I raised earlier, that kind of, completely unconstrained choice of the radical existentialist freedom on the one hand, and that kind of frog-marched automation of a certain conception of training. That what improvisers do when they are improvising is that they are responsive to an established pattern, that there might be a chord progression that the musician is improvising on. There's sort of a standard that they're sort of departing from, whose melody that they're constantly playing upon. The different musicians are doing different things, and what one musician does then informs what another musician does. So it's not that they're simply doing whatever they wish, but rather that they are responsive to what has already been established. And good improvisation is one that finds a middle way between banality and chaos, right? That if on one hand, you're simply just kind of like playing the same note or repeating the same thing, then you've got something dull. If you just completely cut loose from any established pattern, then what you've got is chaos. What's beautiful in good improvisation is finding a certain originality within an established pattern. And just if you read about improvisation or study it yourself, you see very quickly that most people who are interested in this talk about attentiveness as being key. That you might say that an accomplished musician isn't so much playing their instrument as listening very carefully. And in theatrical improvisation, which is something I'm a bit more familiar with, there's a really strong emphasis placed on listening. The idea being that, if you're thinking of the clever thing to say next, you're going to kill the scene. What you need to do is listen very carefully and pay very close attention to what your scene partners are doing. And in paying close attention, you start to see possibilities that might not have been accessible earlier. That's like a template for what I think is going on in this conception of play that I think is important to Wittgenstein. Obviously, improvisation in music and theater is just sort of a template rather than a general case. But I want to suggest that you find that sort of model, this kind of attentive responsiveness, much more broadly in our life. Effectively, this is what a good conversation is not one where I am free to say whatever I want at any point in a conversation. But a fruitful and productive conversation is one where what I say is responsive to the flow of the conversation as it's going, one that isn't banal, and maybe not banal in particular because I'm paying really close attention to you and to what you're saying, and I'm really attuned to what makes this situation unlike every other situation, so that the response I have can be particular to this situation. And this is a form of attentiveness that, again, I think you can find in life more generally. Conversation maybe opens up the scope of possibility, but just in every situation, that there's a sort of a capacity to be responsive in a way that is neither a matter of vertiginously seeing all choices as on the table, nor as one of seeing myself constrained by a particular set of practices. So to wrap up, I want to see if I can say a little bit to situate Wittgenstein between Sartre and Murdoch. So to begin with, as we saw, Sartre conceives of freedom as a kind of radically unconstrained choice. And I suggested that on a certain reading of Wittgenstein, which I associated with Michael Dummett, you can see Wittgenstein also advocating a conception of ourselves as radically unconstrained in the choices we make, far more so than we might suppose. A feature of the existentialist agent, and this is something I think Murdoch is right to identify, is that there's a kind of, the existentialist agent is the untethered originator of action, that what it means to be an agent in the existentialist sense is that somehow I am the source of action, I am the source of choice, and that there's nothing outside of me that in any way limits or constrains that choice. And the way that I've been conceiving Wittgenstein is to sort of maybe shift the emphasis from the idea of ourselves as agents to the idea of ourselves as players. So an agent is sort of, a kind of from nothing, ex nihilo, kind of a source of action. Whereas as a player, what I'm doing is constantly responding to others, responding to a situation, so that my responses aren't simply radically unconstrained, but they are in some sense structured by and responsive to the situation that I find myself in. And so I think that Wittgenstein is with Murdoch in being somewhat skeptical of this emphasis that you find in existentialism on choice and agents as beings that make choices. And as you recall, toward the beginning, I noted that Murdoch's alternative is one that places emphasis rather than on attention and on vision. And I think that this is much closer to what Wittgenstein himself is drawing on, but I think there's also a really interesting and important difference. I flagged earlier that, that there's this motivation problem with existentialism that McManus identifies in the context of Heidegger. I said that, I really do think that this motivation problem should be a worry for Sartre. And I said then that I think it's maybe something that Heidegger finds a way around. And I should say that I think Heidegger is maybe a little closer to Wittgenstein and Murdoch as well. And I wanted to say a little bit about Heidegger before I sort of spell out my difference from Murdoch, because I think that will also help me articulate a difference between Wittgenstein and Heidegger. First of all, where the emphasis is on the agent in Sartre. In Heidegger's work, there's a really interesting emphasis on the grammatical middle voice, that we're neither agents, we're neither active nor passive, but somehow in between. And I think this very much ties into this conception of responsiveness that I've been developing here, that I think for Heidegger, we're not the originators of action so much as we are constantly kind of responding to our situation. And in particular, Murdoch's idea of vision, I think resonates in an interesting way with this moment in Heidegger's articulation of resoluteness, where he describes resoluteness in terms of what he calls a moment of vision, der Augenblick in German. So that, for Heidegger too, that there's a conception of seeing very clearly that is for him crucial to resolute action. A difference I think that you get between Wittgenstein's emphasis on play versus, say, Murdoch and Heidegger on vision is that taking vision as your model is emphasizing a sort of a careful attentiveness to what is there, that your response is to a sort of a pre-given situation, that through the right kind of attention you can see possibilities in. What I find interesting about thinking of play rather than vision as a sort of a model for thinking about what's going on with Wittgenstein is that as a player, it's not that I'm simply apprehending a given situation, but I am in effect creating what's there. The situation that I find myself in is responsive to my own activity, my own engagement, and it's something that I actively shape, but not as an agent, but sort of as this kind of reciprocal player. And so there's sort of maybe slightly more fluidity in this improvisatory model that I'm associating with Wittgenstein than there is in Murdoch's emphasis on vision. These are sort of subtle differences that I'm kind of sketching out in a fairly loose way, but just want to sort of maybe articulate how I see Wittgenstein as neither fully on Murdoch's camp nor fully in Sartre's camp. But that is all I have to say for now. Thank you so much for your